Hey and welcome to Neverwinter with Aragon. So here I'd like to cover the best mount combat powers you should be using in single target fights. This is going to cover tanks, healers and damage dealers. We just obtained a new mount, the Massive Dragon, and it comes with a special power, Mighty Dragon's Roar. This adds to the available support combat powers that you can use in single target. And yes, I've gone and tested this out specifically, and it works very well. People may be confused, but yes, it does increase everybody's damage against the target due to the fact it reduces the target's critical avoidance. What that indirectly means is that any critical hit against the target will have its damage increased by 15%. Resulting in, yes, a damage improvement for anybody who attacks the target. You can cast the power, the dragon will be summoned, it'll roar, and you can see the debuff on the target, reduce the enemy's critical avoidance on top of reducing their damage. And when you attack, you will notice a damage increase. If you just look at the damage formula, you can see, say, putting it in crit severity plus 15% versus minus 15% enemy critical avoidance, exactly the same thing. There's no difference in that. But let's go and compare all of these versus the other ones you can be using. How good is this new Dragon's Roar? Should you prioritize it as something you should use on a healer or a tank to support your team in damage? Well, it will depend if you're in a dungeon or a trial. A dungeon is 5 players, a trial is usually 10 players. And the more players you have, the more other support abilities you can use. For example, artifacts and these mount combat powers. So in a trial scenario where you're going to have a lot of damage boosts, damage debuffs and damage buffs, we set that at 150% and 90%, and it results in this damage gain across all of these other support mounts. You can see exactly where they come from as well, just with the little text next to their name, the benefits they actually give you, and overall then the damage they would result in everybody dealing against the target when you're at these values. All of those debuffs will come from particularly artifacts. You'll get like 120%, and the rest will be mount combat powers that you'll be using here. The Pegasus comes out on top in a trial scenario due to the fact that you can't actually get a whole lot more damage buffs than like what you're getting through your character and some other minor support benefits. Not many other powers will give a damage buff to your team. That is then followed by the Red Dragon. Because of that critical avoidance, it results in effectively giving you more critical severity, and since that is maxed out at 90%, it results in more damage gain compared to just adding more debuffs on top of the load that you already have. That's what Swarm, Eclipse Lion, and the T-Rex mounts will do. They'll all just add like a 15% incoming damage received debuff, and that results in like 6% when you're already at 150%. So hopefully that helps to rank all of them. Again, that's in a trial group. But ultimately, yeah, with 4 supports, which is the usual setup, 2 tanks, 2 healers, you're going to be using Pegasus, Red Dragon, Swarm, Eclipse Lion. And I would recommend then dropping out the T-Rex unless you have a 5th support. And that is also because the Red Dragon is going to also reduce the enemy's outgoing damage, meaning you can use it as even a mitigation effect. Now, some of you may be concerned as this power is very similar to, say, the Bat Swarm from the Swarm mount, and I have gone and checked, and yes, they do stack with each other. As you can see here, we gain an increase in damage from just using the Red Dragon. The Red Dragon does work the way it says it does, giving that damage boost. We can compare it versus Swarm, and you can see in this dungeon scenario, your Swarm will result in a little bit more damage. As you can see there, like 32,000 to 34,000. But then in a trial scenario with like an artifact call, you can see a Swarm is actually going to result in a less damage gain, like 135,000 and versus 138,000. Again, that's exact values we're seeing in game here as well. So that is the ranking then if you're within a 10-man trial group. Now we jump to a dungeon group, so just 5 people. You'll only have like 1 tank and 1 healer as normal. The best 2 I would use here is just Swarm and Eclipse Lion, because They're both debuffs, and you're not going to have a whole lot of extra debuffs like you would have in a trial, and therefore these come out as the most impactful. On top of that, they reduce the outgoing damage of the enemy and the swarm, even reducing their critical hit chance. So that'll help in mitigation checks if there are any as well. But ultimately, yeah, you could use Swarm, Eclipse Lion, Pegasus, even the Red Dragon and the T-Rex. They're okay. You can see the damage differences are very minimal there. The T-Rex I have ranked just lower just because it does not have that reduce the outgoing damage effect as like Eclipse Lion and Swarm have, and even the Red Dragon has that. But again, you can see all the benefits of those and the buffs they would give you when you're at like 90% debuffs and 90% damage buffs. That is particularly important. So it does change a little bit when you're in a dungeon group, but it's still nonetheless very viable to run, say, the Red Dragon there if that was your only support mount. Now we jump to damage dealers. You should not be using a support mount. You're built to deal damage. Supports, like tanks and healers, are not built to deal damage. So if they were to use just a mount power that would deal raw output and damage, it would not nearly be as effective. If I was to use this power 3000 magnitude on my tank, it would deal like 5 times less damage than on a damage dealer who's actually built with maxing out offensive stats and increasing their damage buffs. So I'm far better off just using something like the Bat Swarm to increase everybody's damage, the Dragon's Roar also increasing everybody's damage, because my own will just be minuscule. But if you are a damage dealer and have built yourself to output damage, you want to use one of these that has a raw maximum amount of damage. And the best ones we can find in the game right now are these. So the top 4 here are all pretty much tied, but it does matter a little bit if you're a magical damage dealer or a physical damage dealer. You will generally know that because, yeah, your damage even thematically will be magical or it will be physical. And you'll see down here, you're going to have a magical damage boost and a physical damage boost. And that just comes from the ability scores, strength with physical, intelligence with magical. So depending what you are, you could be a wizard, warlock, cleric, they're all magical. You could be a barbarian, a fighter, a rogue, they're all physical. And so it will depend which mount you ideally want to use. So the only real good one that's physical is Big Base Hand. There are 3 that are magical that are pretty much exactly the same. Tunnel Vision, Legendary Giant Toad, Golden Warhorse. Now Tunnel Vision is just the name of that power. There are a lot of different mounts that can actually give that one, so I can't just go and list that mount. If you don't have it already on 3000 magnitude, it will show a list of what mounts are providing it to you, and then you can go and selectively upgrade that one. Again, here is listed where you can get those mounts. So Legendary Giant Toad, I would generally get it from the Reaper's Challenge store, Golden Warhorse Appointment Event store, so on and so forth. So those top 4 are like the ones you should be using. There are some alternatives, but they will just all result in you dealing less damage in general. There is the Dragonbone Golem, which yes, does state it has higher magnitude than I have listed right there. And that is because this power doesn't actually deal 3450 magnitude. It only deals 3080. And it scales off your magical damage boost. It deals 11 hits, whereas I believe it should actually deal 12 hits if it was to get up to the tooltip's stated magnitude. Some may argue that, sure, that's 80 more magnitude than these other mount powers. And I would say that's not worth it because it's going to deal those 11 hits over 11 seconds, which means you have artifact calls where you can deal like 3-4 times more damage, but only within 10 seconds. So it ends up better to just use a big one-hit mount power in that 10 seconds at like the peak time in the middle versus something that's going to deal damage over time during that, because you won't have then all of the damage in one burst hit. It'll be spread out and it'll result in just less damage because you don't have reliably up all of the debuffs. You can't like align it for during the peak time. And on top of that, its 11 hits are actually over 11 seconds. Other than that, there's the Zodar armor, which is 2400 magnitude. It's physical. It gives you a 15% damage buff as well for 10 seconds, but the actual damage from the mount is not affected by that 15%, which means in the majority of cases, it's just not worth using this. You're not going to output enough damage to make the most of that 15% versus just extra 600 magnitude you'd get from one of these other top mount powers. Same story with Slab of Vecna, although this 15% damage buff does affect the mount power, which is good, but there's a bug that only gains 3% from Minsk and 0% from Batiri, resulting in it being even worse than the Zodar armor. Maybe that can get fixed one day, and that would actually be a fairly useful mount power. And finally, there's Unity the Unicorn, which is just 2700, and then a 5% combat advantage buff to allies. Most people will already be maxed out reliably with that combat advantage, make no use of it, and then it's very simply just 300 less magnitude than one of these top ones, resulting in there being no point in using it versus them. So ultimately, I would definitely recommend you have one of these top 4 as a damage dealer. Yes, you don't have to go for Bigby's Hand because that can be super expensive if you're a physical damage dealer. Don't worry so much and just go for like the legendary giant toad, which is probably the easiest to obtain from the Raper's Challenge store, or just tunnel vision from so many different epic mounts. Check your auction house, you can even check collections, and when you just go and right click those mounts, you'll see what different powers they'll give you. For example, this aberrant Feywolf gives tunnel vision, so does this Drake, along with this gilded giant spider, etc, etc. So hopefully this helps to cover all of the best mount combat powers you should be using in single target. I have covered the ones for multi-target, but expect those to change. If we did get some word from the devs that they are not exactly happy with the current state of multi-target mount powers. Also keep in mind, in multi-target you can use like the T-Rex as a support, because that's going to be a multi-target debuff effect. It doesn't have that big of a target cap, but it can be useful. Same with the Pegasus, as that's just going to give a damage buff to your allies, causing them to just deal more damage. Also, Pegasus does some pretty good damage in itself. But things like Eclipse Lion are just going to push enemies away, which makes it pretty bad, and Swarm only hits like one target. So once again, thank you for watching. A special thank you to all of these channel members, and we'll see you guys around. Goodbye for now.